In the autumn of 1964, as the political winds shifted in Moscow, a different kind of revolution was taking shape at the Kirov plant in Leningrad. In September, a machine unlike any other in the Eastern Bloc rolled into existence. It stood nearly 12 feet tall, painted in a defiant industrial yellow, weighing approximately 12 metric tons. Its 8-cylinder diesel engine produced 215 horsepower, raw, uncompromising power meant to tame the vast steppes of Kazakhstan. This was the Kirovets K-700, and it was born from a single desperate command from the very top of the Soviet state. Nikita Khrushchev had demanded that Soviet agriculture catch up and overtake America. This tractor was the physical answer to that political cry. It wasn't just a piece of farm equipment, it was a declaration of industrial war, a steel titan built to prove a system's superiority. Yet, for all its imposing Soviet presence, the story of this machine begins not in a Leningrad design bureau, but with an official technological partnership that predated the Cold War tensions, a foundation laid by the very nation it was meant to defeat. To understand the sheer ambition of the K-700, you have to understand the scale of the problem it was designed to solve. In 1954, Khrushchev launched the Virgin Lands campaign to bring 28 to 30 million hectares of uncultivated land in Kazakhstan and Siberia under the plow, roughly the size of Italy. It was a political response to systemic agricultural failure. Rather than reform the collective farm system, the leadership chose geographic expansion, conquering nature instead of fixing management. The philosophy was pure Soviet industrial thinking. Apply brute force over finesse, prioritize quantity over quality. The sheer, overwhelming scale of these new fields demanded an equally massive machine. The existing tractors, like the DT-54, were simply too small, too slow for the task. The mandate created a vacuum, and into that vacuum stepped the engineers with an impossible task: build a tractor that could work thousands of hectares with minimal support, that could operate in brutal conditions, and that could be produced in the numbers required by the state plan. This was the stage set for a technological solution to what was, at its heart, a management crisis. The 1957 slogan, "Catch Up and Overtake America," became the driving force behind every decision in Soviet tractor design for the next decade. It was no longer about building a good tractor, it was about building a tractor that could win a Cold War. The pressure was immense. In a command economy, failure wasn't an option. Kirov engineers weren't just designing a machine, they were forging a symbol. Every component had to signal Soviet strength. But this top-down approach bred flaws. Designs chased quotas and mandates, not farmers' needs or farm economics. Conceived in 5-year plans while American rivals were refined by profit and loss reality, the K-700 served statistics measured in hectares and quotas, not bushels per acre or long-term soil health. The K-700 was being born into a system with no feedback, no consequences for poor design, and no reward for excellence beyond meeting the plan. It was a monument to a philosophy that valued the plan over the people who had to execute it. Meanwhile, the American agricultural landscape was undergoing its own paradigm shift, but one driven by entirely different forces. While Soviet planners looked at maps and set targets, American manufacturers were looking at their customers. They were responding to a dramatic consolidation in farming. Between 1960 and 1965, the number of farms in the United States dropped by over 500,000. The farms that remained were getting larger, more specialized, and more demanding of their equipment. They needed machines that could cover more ground with greater efficiency, and they had the capital to invest in technology that delivered a clear return. This created a feedback loop of innovation that the Soviet system could never replicate. A farmer who bought a John Deere 4010 expected it to last, to be comfortable, to operate for long hours, and to have readily available parts and service. If it didn't, he would buy from International Harvester or Ford next time. This simple market mechanism, the power of choice, forced American manufacturers to listen, to adapt, and to constantly improve. The Soviet collective farm manager had no such power. He took what the state gave him, and he made it work, or he failed. In Portland, Oregon, the Wagner Tractor Company had been pioneering a radical new concept since the early 1950s. The articulated four-wheel drive tractor. Their model, the Wagner WA-14, was a true innovator. Unlike traditional tractors, it featured a hinge in the middle, articulated steering, that allowed the front and rear axles to pivot independently. This design, with equal-sized wheels on all four corners, provided incredible traction and stability, making it ideal for massive earth-moving and agricultural projects on difficult terrain. It was a machine born not from a state decree, but from solving practical problems for logging and construction companies facing challenging ground. Its design was elegant in its functionality, a response to real-world needs, yet to most of the world and certainly to the American public, Wagner was an obscure name. The glory went to giants like John Deere and International Harvester. Unknown to almost everyone, this obscure American tractor would become the official template for Soviet ambition. The path of technological transfer began years before the Cold War tensions peaked. In the early 1950s, the Soviet Union established a direct contractual relationship with Wagner Brothers, acquiring the technical knowledge and design principles that would form the foundation of their massive tractor program. This official partnership provided the Soviet engineers with the blueprint they needed. The irony is profound. The Soviet Union's great bid for agricultural technological independence, the machine meant to prove they could do it on their own, began with a foundational act of technological transfer from the very nation it sought to surpass. The Soviet engineers set to work. They took the Wagner's brilliant articulated concept, the hinge, the equal-sized wheels, the four-wheel drive system, and scaled it up to meet their mandate for sheer size and power. But in the translation, something was lost. The Wagner was a nimble giant for its size, designed for precision and power. The Soviet adaptation focused overwhelmingly on the power. The K-700 would be heavier, more brutal in its operation. It was the difference between innovation and imitation. Wagner had built the future based on a vision of efficiency. The Soviets built a monument based on a need for scale. The K-700 was a Wagner in its bones, but its soul was forged in the fires of political necessity. This borrowed blueprint was about to collide with the fully realized market-tested power of the American agricultural juggernaut, setting the stage for a clash that was about far more than horsepower. The Wagner itself represented a different kind of American story, not of a corporate giant, but of a small, innovative company pushing the boundaries of what was possible. It was this spirit of bottom-up innovation, rather than top-down mandate, that the Soviets could not copy, even as they copied the machine itself. They could replicate the steel and the diesel engine, but they could not replicate the competitive ecosystem that had given birth to the idea in the first place. While the Soviets were reverse engineering their single Wagner tractor in secret, American agricultural innovation was unfolding as a public spectacle of market confidence. On August 30, 1960, in the sweltering heat of Dallas, Texas, John Deere staged what would become a legendary event in farm machinery history, Deere Day. This was not a mere product launch, it was a confident, brash declaration of market leadership. The company flew in thousands of dealers and journalists from across the country, putting on a show of force that demonstrated a system working exactly as intended. The centerpiece was the new generation of power, a complete line of tractors that rendered their entire previous lineup obsolete overnight. This was the American philosophy in action, not a state-mandated monolithic solution, but a slate of competitive options designed to meet the precise, evolving needs of individual farmers. The atmosphere was electric, a blend of Texas showmanship and Midwestern pragmatism, signaling that this was more than just new equipment, It was a new era. The star of the show was the Model 4010. Where the emerging Soviet K-700 was a study in brute force, the 4010 was a masterpiece of refined engineering. It offered 84 horsepower when tested from a smooth, modern six-cylinder engine, a radical departure from the iconic two-cylinder putt-putt engines that had defined the brand for decades. It was a machine built for efficiency in the field, translating power into usable, controllable work with minimal waste. The market's response was immediate and decisive. John Deere's market share, which had hovered around 23%, surged to 34% within 5 years. Rivals like International Harvester and Ford responded with their own innovations, igniting a horsepower war that pushed features, power, and efficiency forward at a rapid pace. In the Eastern Bloc, by contrast, the K-700 was allocated rather than chosen. This American confidence was rooted in intensified production. From 1950 to 1965, U.S. farm output increased by 35% on 11% less cropland. Larger farms required equipment that was powerful, reliable, and efficient. The John Deere 4010 and soon the 4020 fit that need, emphasizing refined hydraulics, better transmissions, and operator-friendly controls to translate power into consistent field performance. The summer of 1962 saw the two opposing philosophies finally materialize in the physical form, ready for their ultimate test not in a showroom or a political rally, but in the dirt. In Leningrad, the first Kirovets K-700 rolled off the assembly line, a tangible manifestation of Soviet ambition. That same period, John Deere was putting the finishing touches on its response to the new generation's own success, the Model 4020, which would be introduced in 1964. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would play out across the world's farmlands for the next decade. On one side stood the K-700, 203 horsepower, 12.8 tons of yellow steel, a leviathan built for scale. On the other stood the 4020, delivering 91 horsepower at the power takeoff, a relatively svelte 4 tons of green and yellow precision built for performance. The numbers alone suggested a mismatch, but the real story was hidden in the details of how these machines translated power into productivity. The fundamental difference emerged in their power-to-weight ratio and its consequences. The K-700 had immense power, but it was saddled with a colossal weight, a necessity of its rugged, simple construction. This weight became its greatest liability in the field. The K-700 was notorious for causing severe soil compaction. East German agronomists documented that the tractor's sheer size often resulted in soil degradation so severe that fields required years to recover. The sheer mass of the machine, necessary to handle its own engine's torque, pressed the soil particles together, destroying the delicate structure that allowed roots to grow and water to penetrate. It was a machine that sacrificed the long-term health of the land for short-term brute force. Furthermore, the operator's environment was an afterthought. The cabin was loud, filled with the deafening roar and high vibration of its massive diesel engine, and the controls were heavy and cumbersome. It was a machine that demanded endurance from its driver, a tool of pure production that viewed the human operator as just another component in the system. The John Deere 4020, in stark contrast, was a study in efficiency. Its higher power-to-weight ratio meant it could do more work with less strain on the soil, preserving fertility for future seasons. Its true genius was in operation. The 4020 offered an optional power shift transmission that let the operator change gears under load without clutching. Smooth, continuous power that maximized field time and reduced fatigue. The farmer sat in a relatively comfortable, climate-controlled environment, master of a sophisticated tool designed to work with the land, not conquer it. This was the physical manifestation of the ideological divide. The K-700 defined power as sheer force, the ability to move a massive weight and pull immense loads. The 40-20 defined power as control, the precise, intelligent application of energy to achieve a goal with minimal waste. One was a blunt instrument, the other a precision tool. The Soviet machine was designed to conquer the land. The American machine was designed to cultivate it sustainably. But the true test of these philosophies wasn't just in the field, it was on the factory floor and in the marketplace, where production numbers would tell a story of two vastly different economic realities. The Kirov plant began churning out K-700s with the relentless pace demanded by the state plan. By 1975, they had built over 100,000 of these yellow giants. On the surface, this was an impressive figure, a testament to Soviet industrial capacity. But this number masked a critical inefficiency. These machines were not sold in a competitive market. They were allocated to the captive markets of the Eastern Bloc. In countries like East Germany, economic planners performed cold, hard calculations and arrived at a staggering conclusion. A K-700 needed to run a minimum of 1,400 hours per year just to be considered economically viable for the collective farm. This wasn't a target. It was a bare minimum for survival. To achieve this, many farms ran the machines on dual shifts, pushing them day and night. The K-700 was a machine built for quantity, but its sheer operational demands and lack of finesse made it a constant liability. Its reputation became mixed, respected for its raw power, but feared for its insatiable appetite for fuel and maintenance, and its destructive impact on the soil it was meant to cultivate. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, John Deere was engaged in a different kind of production race. Between 1964 and 1972, they sold 184,000 of their 4820 tractors. The key word is sold. These machines weren't allocated by a central plan, they were purchased by individual farmers in a fiercely competitive global market. They didn't just run, they generated profit, they increased yields, and they fueled an American agricultural export boom that grew at an astonishing 11.7% annually throughout the 1970s. The verdict was being delivered not in a political speech, but in production ledgers and international trade balances. The American system was expanding its global reach, while the Soviet system remained contained within its sphere of influence. One was a dynamic, outward-looking engine of growth. The other was a closed loop, a system that consumed its own resources to meet its own quotas, with little regard for true economic efficiency. The production numbers told a story of quality, triumphing over mere quantity, of machines that created value, rather than just fulfilling a plan. This divergence was reflected in the very fabric of the two nations' agricultural economies. By the close of the 20th century, the United States would account for a third of the world's wheat exports, and nearly 70% of its corn exports. This dominance wasn't built on a single model of tractor, but on a system that produced a whole ecosystem of specialized, efficient equipment. The K-700, for all its imposing presence, was largely absent from world markets outside the Eastern Bloc. It was a machine designed for a specific, state-mandated task, and it lacked the refinement and support network to compete internationally. The production race revealed that the American approach, building a variety of machines to meet diverse needs, was fundamentally more resilient and adaptable than the Soviet model of building a single, monolithic solution. The 100,000 K-700s represented a massive industrial effort, but they served a system that was already showing signs of profound strain. The 184,000 John Deere 4020s, however, represented the tools of a system that was on the verge of feeding the world. The first major public crack in the Soviet facade appeared with shocking speed. In 1963, just a year after the K-700 began rolling off the production line, the Soviet Union was forced to make its first significant grain imports from the West. This was a profound humiliation. The Virgin Lands Campaign, The great hope of Khrushchev's agricultural policy was already failing. Yields were declining, and the soil, abused by massive machines and poor farming practices, was losing its fertility. The K-700, for all its thunderous power, couldn't fix the systemic rot that plagued Soviet agriculture. The poor management on collective farms, the catastrophic storage losses that saw a significant portion of the harvest rot before it reached people's tables, and a labor system that required 2.3 to 7.3 times more human effort per unit of output than American farms. The machine was a technological marvel, but the system it served was fundamentally broken. The core of the failure was the absence of a feedback loop. In the American system, prices acted as signals. If a certain crop wasn't profitable, farmers would shift to something else. If a piece of equipment was inefficient, the manufacturer would go out of business. In the Soviet command economy, there were no such price signals to guide efficient production decisions. A central planner in Moscow would dictate how much wheat should be grown in Kazakhstan, with no real understanding of local conditions or economic realities. There was no competition to spur better design, and no connection between the effort of the collective farm worker and his reward. This systemic failure affected how the machines were used. The K-700 was often pushed to its limits to meet targets, with little regard for long-term consequences. Intended to mechanize the steppe at scale, it became a heavy, demanding piece of industrial equipment that reflected the gulf between political ambition and agricultural reality. The political fallout was inevitable. Nikita Khrushchev, the man who had launched the Virgin Lands campaign and demanded the creation of machines like the K-700, was ousted from power in 1964. While there were many factors behind his removal, the disappointment of his agricultural policies, the failure to truly catch up and overtake America, was a significant contributor. The K-700, his great steel hope, was now the symbol of a promise unfulfilled. It continued to be produced in vast numbers, but it was fighting a losing battle against a system it was never designed to fix. The cracks were not just appearing, they were widening into chasms, and the ultimate verdict on this technological and ideological competition was yet to come. It would arrive not with a political coup or a diplomatic incident, but with a simple, desperate act of commerce that would reveal the true balance of power in the agricultural Cold War. The stage was set for the final and most ironic chapter in the story of the Soviet Iron Giant. The ultimate verdict on this technological and ideological competition arrived not with a bang, but with a purchase order that echoed around the world. In the early 1970s, a series of poor harvests exposed the Soviet system's fatal weakness with brutal clarity. Despite thousands of K-700s working the vast collective farms across Kazakhstan and Siberia, the system could not produce enough to feed its own people. The Virgin Lands, once hailed as the breadbasket of the future, were yielding diminishing returns, their soils exhausted by relentless, large-scale farming methods that prioritized short-term quotas over long-term sustainability. The political promise of self-sufficiency had collapsed under the weight of agricultural reality. Between 1971 and 1973, the Soviet Union executed what became known in the West as the Great Grain Robbery. Facing potential famine, Soviet trade officials entered the global market and secretly negotiated the purchase of 19 million metric tons of American grain. This staggering amount included 1/4 of the entire U.S. wheat harvest. The irony was absolute and devastating. The nation that had set out to catch up and overtake America, that had built the K-700 as a symbol of its industrial and agricultural might, was now utterly dependent on its capitalist rival for survival. The very grain that fed Soviet citizens was grown by American farmers on family farms, harvested by John Deere and International Harvester tractors, and sold through the market system the Soviets denounced. This event was more than a simple trade deal. It was a geopolitical earthquake. It revealed that the agricultural Cold War had been decisively lost. The K-700, for all its thunderous power and symbolic weight, had proven powerless against the deep-seated inefficiencies of the system it was built to serve. It could tear through the soil, but it couldn't fix the broken logistics, the demotivated labor, or the catastrophic storage losses that claimed approximately 20% of the Soviet harvest before it could be consumed. The machine was a monument to a philosophy that believed technology could overcome systemic flaws, but the grain ships steaming across the Atlantic were the final, undeniable proof that it could not. The Soviet Union had built a giant to move the earth, but it was the American system of flexible, market-responsive family farms that knew how to make the earth fruitful. The financial scale of this dependence was staggering. From 1961 to 1985, the Soviet Union spent an estimated $152 billion on food and agricultural imports globally, with approximately half sourced from developed Western nations. This capital, roughly $76 billion from the West alone, could have been invested in modernizing Soviet industry or improving the lives of its citizens, but was instead funneled abroad to cover a fundamental failure of its own economic model. The K-700, once the pride of Soviet engineering, now stood as a bitter reminder of this miscalculation. It was the most powerful tractor in the Eastern Bloc, yet the country that built it could not feed itself. The agricultural war was not decided by which country built the bigger tractor, but by which system could reliably, efficiently, and sustainably produce food. The machine that was meant to be the symbol of Soviet power had become a monument to its limitations, a 13-ton testament to the triumph of a responsive system over a rigid, politically driven component. The real story of this conflict was never about a single machine outperforming another. It was about a complete, adaptive system versus a powerful but isolated component. Competition among manufacturers, John Deere, International Harvester, Ford, Allis-Chalmers, created relentless pressure to refine hydraulics, transmissions, and power delivery. That pressure helped drive a 35% output increase on 11% less land from 1950 to 1965, translating engineering advances directly into field productivity. The Soviet failure, conversely, stemmed from a rigid model of centralized planning that had no mechanism for this kind of feedback. There were no price signals to guide efficient production decisions, no competition to spur better design, and no meaningful connection between the collective farm worker's effort and his reward. Innovation was dictated from the top down, based on political goals rather than practical needs. The system was designed for control, not for adaptation. The K-700 was a perfect component dropped into a fundamentally flawed machine. It was like installing a jet engine in a horse-drawn cart. The power was immense, but the structure around it couldn't harness that power effectively. The cart would simply shake itself apart, and the ultimate symbol of this entire story lies in the K-700's very origins. This great Soviet tractor, this emblem of a planned economy's ambition to achieve independence, was itself a copy of an American Wagner design. The Soviet solution to American dominance was, in fact, American. This fact encapsulates the core philosophical difference. The American system was capable of generating original ideas, like the Wagner's articulated steering from the bottom up. The Soviet system could only imitate, and even then, it imitated imperfectly, stripping away the finesse and focusing only on the scale. It was not a horsepower war that was lost in the fields of the Cold War. It was a philosophy war. The component, no matter how powerful, could never overcome the system. The legacy is clear. In the long run, adaptation, feedback, and competition will always beat centralized control and brute force. The American supermarket, with its endless choices, became the true symbol of Cold War victory, not because of its abundance, but because of the resilient, innovative system that created that abundance. The K-700 was a testament to what a nation could build when it focused all its resources on a single goal. But the American agricultural machine was a testament to what a society could achieve when it empowered its people to invent, to compete, and to build a better world from the ground up. The Kirovets K-700 outlived the Soviet Union that created it, a testament to its rugged, uncompromising engineering. Today, these yellow giants still rumble across fields in Russia and former Soviet states, cherished by collectors and still capable of hard work. But they are also permanent monuments to a failed philosophy. They are relics of a system that believed a machine could solve a human problem, that scale could triumph over sustainability, and that a command from the top could replace the wisdom of the market. The real battle was never tractors against tractors, but systems against systems. One system, built on competition and choice, fostered resilience, innovation, and ultimately fed the world. The other, built on mandate and control, collapsed under the weight of its own inefficiency. The echo of that struggle still rumbles through the fields of history today, a reminder that the most powerful technology is not the biggest engine, but the most adaptable system. The land itself bears the marks of this contest, and the story of the Kirovets K-700 remains one of the most profound ironies of the Cold War. If you have memories of these iconic machines, share your stories in the comments below. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe so you won't miss our upcoming stories. Thank you for joining us on this journey through agricultural history.